So the Cook Islands are 17,000 people, but in comparison, we have Trinidad and Tobago, which is where I'm from, which is 1.4 million people. And we're one of the larger of those small islands in the Caribbean. We also have a lot of populations that are much smaller than us, under 100,000 people, in some cases even under 10,000 people in one island, Montserrat, which was decimated by a volcano several years ago. Can you just go back to the previous slide, if you don't mind? Kindly go back to this previous slide. Yeah, I think we lost the slide that I was on before. Thank you. Yeah, so we have countries like Montserrat, which were decimated by a volcano in, oh my goodness, what's happening? Okay, thanks. Maybe about 20 to 30 years ago, and they have less than 5,000 people living on that island. And as you can imagine, given that wide range of numbers of people living in populations on basically what are rocks in the middle of the ocean, things like internet access and economic development based on the internet economy is very challenging. But this slide tends to show, it gives you a good sense based on two groups of islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, the range of islands that you would see in the Pacific and Caribbean. One of our major challenges, as you'll see on that slide, isolation from foreign markets, lack of natural resources in many of the islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. Actually, there is a significant lack of natural resources, and they tend to rely primarily on industries such as tourism or agriculture that would be their main source of income. And of course, if a natural disaster or something like a pandemic happens, what will happen to the country? In that scenario, their income is completely removed, and all the revenue that is designed to keep the country afloat, far less to drive the internet economy, will be very much limited. So the issue of natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, really impacts small and developing states quite heavily, and of course impact the issues related to internet infrastructure. And quite generally speaking, within SIDS, small and developing states, we have a significant lack of infrastructure within the country, not just internet infrastructure, but basic infrastructure like roads, water, electricity, and so on are very problematic in many of those countries, not least of which because several of these islands are separated by thousands of miles of water, and to connect the islands together would be problematic at best, and in some cases impossible, because to connect, for example, if you want to connect a group of hundreds of small islands, which is in many cases you have that in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, we have a couple of those. To connect these chains of islands with fiber under the sea, it's going to be very expensive and not feasible, because on some of those very small islands, you have very, very, very small populations. So what happens in those islands, you would have to be connecting them through some other means, satellite or other wireless communications. And of course, for those who understand that technology, we all know how that can be problematic for consistent connectivity throughout. Even doing things like Zoom meetings will be problematic for them. Next slide, please. So this introduction to the Dynamic Coalition of Small and Developing States and what the internet economy means for SIDS is going to take this form. We're going to look at a historical perspective, why the SIDS and the Dynamic Coalition that relates to SIDS is important. How do we develop an effective internet economy for SIDS in our regions? and some objectives of regional DC SIDS for 2021-22. Next slide. Right, so Maureen, of course, is not, this is a presentation we have done for general purpose use. So Maureen and myself, who are the co-chairs of the DC, are presenting this depending on what forum we are at. So today I'm presenting in terms of the youth LAC IGF. As you can see there, somewhat updated my portfolio. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm the immediate past chair of the Untitled Chapter, but I wear a couple other hats that are listed there. And my colleague Maureen, who some of you may be aware, is also the chair of the At-Large Advisory Committee of ICANN, and she is also the chair of the .Asia organization and many other internet governance structures. So we both organized this dynamic coalition, and as you can see here on the right-hand side of the slide, we've been quite active at the IGF. In particular, we both met at ICANN and ICANN meeting 11 years ago in Cartagena, Colombia. Actually, we met before that, I should say. We met in Sharm el-Sheikh at an IGF in 2009. But we really got to know each other in 2010 at Cartagena, Colombia. So we've done all these workshops, and in 2021 we'll also be doing another workshop at the IGF in the hybrid form that it's in. Next slide, please. So why is DC SIDS important? Well, again, I think just to give you a brief understanding of what the SIDS are, they are approximately 50, depending on who you ask, between 50 and 55 small island developing nations, which is quite a large number. It's more than Latin America combined. So we have individual, very small but sovereign nations that number around 50, 55, depending on the metric you use. We are using the Dynamic Coalition to establish new networks and contacts, to share experiences, interests, and concerns about internet development within our nations and regions, to do virtual meetings at the Global IGF, and to bring remote participation more fully in, because as we all know, getting to a physical meeting at the IGF, even before the pandemic, was challenging. So we've always been a big fan of promoting remote participation, even before virtual IGF started, and because we don't have many SIDS coming to IGF meetings, so most of our participation has been remote participation. And we focus our membership on working together as SIDS. So it's not the typical topic-driven dynamic coalition around community networks or security issues or human rights or those types of things. The topic really is the actual fact that we are small and developing states, and how do we work together to build our economies in this internet-driven system, the digital economy, and what can we learn from each other, because to a large extent, many of us have been very similar histories, and what we're trying to do as SIDS is share those experiences and build best practices across our regions. And of course, in this scenario, the Caribbean region is the one that we refer to. Next slide, please. All right. Again, for the DC SIDS, membership is voluntary and formal. You don't have to be a member of, you don't have to be living in a small and developing state to join. You can join if you're from anywhere in the world, if you're interested in SIDS activities. Our work is kind of driven around the global IGF frameworks, and is also driven primarily by the efforts of our regional member organizations. In many cases, the Pacific regional organizations such as PIC-ISOC, which is the Pacific Islands Chapter of Internet Society, the Pacific IGF, and Pacific Islands organizations, and in the Caribbean IGF, kind of other organizations that are driving the Caribbean agenda. What we intend to do is enhance internet-related opportunities within our communities. And at the very end, I'll show you a scenario of what one opportunity that I've seen emerging based on work that I'm doing now. But basically what we're trying to do is ensure that the internet economy grows and is driven forward by small and developing states, in spite of the challenges that we are facing. So we'd like to use the internet and digital services, digital sector, to drive our economies forward and work together, learn from each other, because in many of our islands, the internet is not a priority issue, and the digital economy is far less a priority issue. So by working together, we maybe can, by sharing experiences, we can probably convince our various governments, our various civil society actors, our technical communities, our academia, to take a look at digital and the internet as one lever of driving our growth and development. Because as some of you who understand what's happening in the SIDS, we're all threatened by climate change. We're all threatened by very small, as I mentioned earlier, economic shocks that can reverberate to the highest levels. The pandemic has decimated almost every single economy in the Caribbean and the Pacific region. Growth, which was already small or negative, is now at negative 10% or more in many of the region, in the Caribbean and in the Pacific Islands. What are we trying to do? Besides this, we're trying to really show how we can, perhaps access funding from regional or local sources to assist with our promotional outreach activities and promote what we're doing, which is one reason why I think that we've been asked to come to the table here and showcase what we're doing, because I think it's very important, especially given that the Caribbean is located within the Latin American Caribbean region, that we demonstrate that we are here, and what we need to do is work more closely with our neighbors in the Latin America space to ensure that we don't have a situation where we are working in silos and not trying to learn from each other and work with each other to build out our spaces. Because even within SIDS, Dominican Republic and Haiti, two non-English speaking territories, are in fact part of the SIDS. Dominican Republic is one half of the island of Hispaniola. Haiti is the other half. Haiti speaks French. Dominican Republic speaks Spanish. Small and developing state. Exactly. So we need to really ensure that even though we're the Caribbean, that part of Latin America actually bleeds into small and developing states. So that's important to understand. What have we done in our achievements? We've gained a regular space to have our SIDS actors engage and collaborate on IG and other issues, which is a dynamic coalition. We've raised the visibility of issues facing the SIDS in the internet space. We have been able to structure ourselves, access funding on our own right from sources like the Internet Society, Diplo Foundation, and this will enable us to look at particular issues that impact SIDS internet users in our region. Next slide, please. So some ideas and some samples of what happened during the pandemic for the Cook Islands, which is one of the, as I said earlier, of the territories. The borders were closed in March 2020. Even though there was no COVID at that time on the island, but the fact that there were no people coming into there, no tourists, then the economy was almost devastated. Attempted a bubble was closed off because of COVID clusters. There was an attempt to open it in January 2021, I believe it was closed again, and that was finally opened in May for tourists, and I believe it's still open now. Next slide, please. What has Pick ISOC done? Well, this is quite a lot of information here, so I don't think I want to go through it in great lot of detail. But what we need to understand here is that much of the work of the Dynamic Coalition is driven, as I said earlier, by the structures within the organization. So PIC-ISOC, Pacific IGF, in this case, participation of Apricot, APR IGF, and so on would be part of the work of the Climate Coalition and its members, because our members are very few. As many people kind of suspect, as islanders, people who are interested in internet governance and are participating in that area are few and far between. So we have to wear many hats and stretch ourselves thin across many areas. So you see a lot of the same faces doing many things across many. I don't know how we do it, but we just find a way to get it done across multiple areas, multiple locations, multiple events. And this is something that I think we need some help in. I'm looking forward to working more closely with our colleagues in Latin America to ensure we can get some of this help going forward. Next slide, please. All right, so again, in PIC-ISOC, recently they had the Pacific IGF in September, and we're also looking to work more closely with Internet Society on other events that are happening throughout the year. So this is something that the DC SIDS members have been constantly working to achieve, and will continue to do so in the coming years. Next slide, please. All right, Pacific Islands Forum, which is the main state agency in the Pacific that works together with members in the DC SIDS. In the DC SIDS, there are Pacific Islands Forum staff members actually who are doing work. And in the Pacific Islands Forum, they have recently created this frame of Pacific regionalism. And in there, as you can see, there's an e-commerce and IT development pillar that relates to what we're trying to achieve under the DC SIDS. Next slide, please. All right, so the Pacific activities over the next year, looking to, under this pillar I mentioned earlier, to be, as you can see in the middle, as I mentioned before, this idea of connectivity is problematic within the region. So those who are interested in these engineering aspects of this, you could just imagine the challenges to connect. Because what you're seeing, if you look carefully at this slide, you can't even see the islands. You know, they're so small. You're just seeing a lot of lines and large islands, but you're seeing basically Australia on the left, just in the bottom left. I think it's Tasmania on top. And all the little dots that things are moving to are islands, but you can barely understand or see these islands. And to find a way to connect these islands is expensive, problematic, and if you were to zoom in on this map even further, you realize that in some cases you're only connecting one of 100 islands. And once you connect that one island, you have to find a way to connect the other islands, which is, as I said earlier, very, very challenging. So that's one of the major projects that need to be done within the next several years, including coming up next year. And on the e-commerce side, there's been a proposal to do a regional e-marketplace, similar to what Alibaba is doing, but on a Pacific scale, and promote a Pacific sponsored top-level domain, promote visibility and accessibility of e-commerce solutions for the region. Next slide. And this is just a sample of what the internet connectivity situations like in the Pacific region, showing some of the cables that have been implemented and some that's coming soon. Next slide. Right. Okay, go ahead. This is just another view of the original slide. Can move past this. Next slide, please. Right. Challenges that we face, as I mentioned before, there are major issues related to the economic situation in the Pacific region, which also translates to the Caribbean region. You'll see on the next few slides, there's some of the similarities between this and the Caribbean. There are still digital divide issues between urban and rural areas on the larger islands. And in some of these, and of course, in the small islands, it just is just poor internet connectivity, full stop. So one of the things that need to happen is to find a way to sort of build economies of scale between major mobile service and ISP operators to pool resources, to build out more sustainable public-private partnerships, PPPs, to boost internet connectivity, and maybe even look at actual new ways of connecting islands together. So for those who are interested in wireless networks and community networks, is something that would be of interest in the region. And of course, there's a series of trade-related digital areas that we need to look at as well. Next slide. So let's take a look at the Caribbean, which I think will be, as we zoom in closer into our own region, this probably looks more familiar to many of you. So this is the Caribbean, and as you can see, the Caribbean stretches from my country, Trinidad and Tobago, which is just off the coast of Venezuela. Then you have over the top of Venezuela around to Colombia, you'll see Curacao, Aruba, then stretching all the way up just to the tip of Miami, which you could not really see so much on the map, but you'll see the Bahamas. That's where the Caribbean essentially ends. So from the Bahamas in the north, as you can see, the Bahamas being from a few islands well, stretching down to Trinidad and Tobago in the south. And just on the east, you have Barbados, which is the most easterly of the Caribbean islands. And coming inward, we also have countries like Belize, which is in Central America, which is also, it's not an island, but it's considered a small developing state. And at the top, which is not laid out on the map, unfortunately, but Guyana and Suriname, which are just neighboring Venezuela, would also be considered to be small and developing states by definition given by United Nations, even though they are not actually islands. And that is an interesting discussion that we probably would not need to have today. But in summarizing, I don't want to repeat exactly what went on in the Pacific, but to a large extent, as we said, we share similar concerns, similar issues. And in summary, our key internet governance issues relate to access and affordability, and digital inclusion, digital literacy, critical internet infrastructure, digital skills development, local content development, cybersecurity, data sovereignty, and emerging technologies. These are the key issues that we need to look at in the Caribbean area. Next slide, please. And looking at the pandemic issues, so specifically in the Caribbean, we saw a major shift to remote work and online learning. Of course, that would have been challenging given the lack of infrastructure in many of the islands and the lack of literacy and the lack of equipment. That would have been problematic, that some countries thought they had equipment, thought people had connectivity, but only when the pandemic hit and we realized that going to do remote work and online learning, it opened up a can of worms that many thousands in particular islands, and in some cases more than that. In my country, in Trinidad and Tobago, 25% of students were indicated they did not have a device or connectivity to conduct online learning, which the government was shocked that they were not aware of the extent of the problem that they were facing. And I believe it's in some other countries even worse than that. Governments were slow to move to digital government prior to the pandemic and had no choice but to move to it, because to conduct services online was the only way they could have continued delivering those services while the pandemic was raging, and it still is raging actually. And in the Caribbean, we still have substantial number of cases and deaths and so on. But at the same time, we also saw the rise of digital entrepreneurship and digital commerce, again, which was a bit slow to emerge. I know it's very similar in Central America as well. So I think we sharing a lot of similarities that during the pandemic, these issues rose forward in the Caribbean as well as in Central America. I believe in some countries in South America, this was already well entrenched. We have been further advanced. But in the Caribbean in particular, and in some countries in Central America, e-commerce and all the issues with digital entrepreneurship were always slow to develop. And this was fully catalyzed during the pandemic. We also saw the emergence of the delivery economy. So that means, for those who don't know, this is the area where, for whatever reason, before it was not something that people would want to do, literally buy online and get things delivered to you within your country. That rapidly took hold because of the obvious issues with the pandemic. So while people seem to like to go out and drive or walk or travel to get their items, their food, or their supermarket items or hardware items, etc., because stores were simply closed, there was no option but to drive a delivery economy aspect of this digital economy forward, which has continued today, even when stores have reopened. Digital health became a major issue for obvious reasons, and we also saw quite a number of opportunities arising in that space for people who are doing, anything from telehealth to e-pharmacy, e-prescriptions, and so on. And we also saw in the Caribbean something quite, relatively unique that would have spread to other countries, maybe even Latin America as well, where special visas and entry stamps were being sold so that people could come to the Caribbean to live for a year or more and work remotely if they're working in the US or Europe or wherever they're working from, work in sunshine. And the boast was that there was good connectivity. The idea was that you'd use the resources in the region and replace the lost tourism industry. So because tourists were not coming to the region, and many of the countries in the Caribbean were really reliant on tourism, this was an opportunity to try and replace that type of tourism with sort of digital nomadic tourism, which was long-term stays, staying in not hotels, but in Airbnbs or perhaps rental apartments, and using the local economy to contribute and buy things and rent cars and so on. So that was another, some of the impacts that happened during the pandemic. Next slide, please. And in terms of what's going on in the Caribbean as a whole for its planning, one of the things, so you saw in the Pacific, there was a strategy on e-commerce. In the Caribbean, we have a strategy on a single ICT space, which is really trying to replicate the thinking of having a single economic space, free movement of people and free movement of goods and services, and shifting that, also replicating, I should say, in the ICT space. So a harmonized ecosystem of policies, legislation, regulations, technical standards, best practices, networks, and services. So there's a dream eventually of having a single regional broadband infrastructure linking all the national infrastructures together, and so that we can have shared services throughout the region, perhaps a data center in one island and a backup data center in another island, and being able to share that type of load across the region and reduce the reliance on North America or even Europe for our services, and even perhaps attract international players like I don't want to name any players in this presentation in that regard, but large international operators of infrastructure and data centers and entertainment and so on. They come and locate their services in the region as sort of what happened, for example, in Asia, where we saw a lot of that going on in Southeast Asia in particular, Singapore being a good example, as well as I believe Malaysia and Indonesia, where many of the international players cited their locations to serve that larger population. We're not that large, and I don't think it's going to be as easy to attract those players, but certainly to try and get that kind of effort done in the region would be important to us. So it really is an attempt to get shared frameworks and shared services throughout the entire region to strengthen our ability to work together and to move things forward. And that's led by the CARICOM, which is the equivalent to the Pacific Islands Forum I mentioned earlier. There's the Caribbean Community, which has a secretariat based in Guyana. There's also the Caribbean Telecommunications Union, which is based in Trinidad and Tobago, which is the ICT agency of CARICOM, and then CANTO, which is the Caribbean Association of National Telecoms Organizations, which is a sort of a private sector-driven organization of ISPs and similar related private sector organizations who support that sector. Next slide, please. Right, so the goals for the DCSIDs in 2021-22 would be to try and move beyond just trying to right now we're still what I would call forming and norming, relying on volunteers to push our work forward. We're trying to work with the UN IGF Secretariat to strengthen our approach, to get our work in sort of in a more cohesive way done. One of the things we're trying to do is build a knowledge base of all these best practices and studies and efforts that have been carried out in the region so that other islands can share and understand what's going on in the various island A, island B, island C, and perhaps learn from that, and also put their own learnings into that repository. We also would like to try and get more intersessional DCSIDs meetings held. The unfortunate thing is because we're so scattered, literally speaking, physically scattered, and also spread across multiple workloads, it's very difficult to have our members focus our energies on this, except at an event like an IGF, because we're all over trying to fix things and work together on our particular regions and our particular countries. So it's very difficult to come together more regularly than the annual approach. We're trying to fix that and probably trying to get more meetings to have our membership come together in between the IGF and perhaps use the opportunity to showcase our services and what has been happening in the interim year that's been going on. Next slide, please. Right, yes, so we're just participating more fully in the IGF system and the UN IGF system, and of course, as I said earlier, to get a more dedicated IGF site, as well as that repository. Next slide, please. All right. Now, as I'm coming to the end of this, I wanted to share with you an opportunity that I'm seeing. So I'm doing a project now in the global postal sector with Dot Post, and I'm realizing that there are opportunities here for the Caribbean as well as Latin America. That I think is very important, that we can take a look at what has been happening and what can happen. And this is something I really wanted to share with you because I believe it's something that's quite important and has been gaining some traction in the United Nations system. It's a United Nations driven project out of the Universal Postal Union. And what we've been seeing is that this postal sector has been really driving innovation, especially in underserved regions and regions that have traditionally disconnected. But because the postal sector has had this learning of the what I would call the offline, the analog world, they've been applying that experience in the digital world and successfully. So you may have heard of many, especially in your countries, the postal sector offering digital government or public service access information centers. That's one layer that we can look at. And in many places, they've been doing bill payments, right? I think that's something that's pretty well known across the Latin America, Caribbean region. But we're also starting to see in that sector e-commerce platforms for micro, small, and medium enterprises starting to emerge. For example, in Costa Rica, Correos de Costa Rica emerged the launch of a Yellow Marketplace. Very recently, Yellow.market, which constitutes a new channel for entrepreneurs who can seek to expand their market through an easily accessible platform for both small and micro enterprises and the end customer, which is another aspect. And we saw before, mentioned the Pacific side, that they're trying to build a marketplace sorry, for the Pacific region. But I think this is something that can be driven by something like the postal sector, because for obvious reasons, the postal sector delivers things. So one of the things that you have missing in many of these marketplaces is the fulfillment side of business. So you may have the marketplace built, but how do you get things fulfilled? Why not use the postal sector to drive that forward for you? So Costa Rica is a very good example of that. Next slide, please. And what you see in this is that the CEO was saying that of Correas to Costa Rica at WSS plus 15 last year, that many SMEs outside the metropolitan areas located in rural communities are now able to sell online to people in the metropolitan area and also sell to other rural places. So we have to find a way, I think, in our region and across one developing states to in a situation like what happened in the pandemic, where our external markets were shut down. How do we serve our internal markets? And by leveraging what's been going on in the postal sector and what's been happening in other countries along these lines, we are probably seeing the emergence of internal digital economies, and we can learn from each other in that regard in our region, across it, and perhaps drive business instead of going out to the traditional North American, European markets, but within our own markets. And one of the things that I'm hoping that will happen is that even within Latin America and the Caribbean or Asia Pacific, we will see more trade between our regions as opposed to going to the outside into the traditional markets. So I'm hoping that's something that can happen next. Next slide, please. And as I was indicating earlier, this particular project is being driven by something called the Dot Post Group. This is actually a internet governance structure. The Dot Post is a contracted party of ICANN. They are a sponsor TLD, and under the Dot Post umbrella, we are seeing heavy focus on support for and outreach in internet economy-driven digital innovation in underserved regions. And in these areas that they're looking at specifically are cybersecurity, digital identity, fintech and digital financial services, and NFTs and other blockchain-based solutions. And what I'm seeing is that these areas, because they're particular areas that can truly benefit our region, both in Latin America and the Caribbean, and across one of the developing states in the Caribbean Pacific, I see the possibility of us all working together in building out new opportunities that will drive economies within our own countries, within our regions, and have trade within our own selves that will allow us to be better insulated from shocks that would occur by something like a pandemic, and also build knowledge and best practices for our own people within our territories. Because one of the things that I mentioned earlier is the issue with digital literacy and digital skills development that has been challenged. I believe that these kinds of projects and these opportunities that would exist are something that we need to take a closer look at, driven by, in our case, the postal sector, which I believe is a really, really interesting case study to take a close look at. And I'm going to ask that, in your country, in your territory, look at what's going on there in the postal sector. Encourage them to do some work in this area if they're not doing it already, and reach out to the groups like the Dot Post group. Give it an address there, secretariat@info.post, more information how to do this. So what I'm going to ask is if I can get this video played, just to wrap up this presentation. Can you just play that video for me, and let's hope the audio comes across.
Welcome to .post, a unique internet space managed by the Universal Postal Union, benefiting its members and the whole postal community. A safe space on the internet dedicated exclusively to postal services, where security is maintained 24 hours a day. Each member of the .post community can offer their postal services with confidence. A unique, innovative, integrated and boundless space in constant expansion. There are already over 50 members in the .post group, taking on the challenge to successfully facilitate cohesive digital strategies globally. Security standards adopted for .post prevent redirection to unintended and fraudulent sites. Phishing attacks, malware, botnet and spam are monitored under .post, complying with incident management procedures. Members can establish secure email solutions under .post as well. .post is a digital gateway to new business possibilities. Posts can extend or transform their traditional services. By using .post, they can improve their visibility, enhancing brand recognition on the internet. .post is a safe and reliable online market space for buyers and sellers. Through .post, members can provide value-added postal services in the cloud and offer secure digital solutions, including e-commerce. Posts have already established a secure online sales channel for stamps and philately products. With .post, customers can track their shipments worldwide through global track and trace .post. The challenge for the .post group is now to continue facilitating a cohesive digital transformation for .post members worldwide, increasing its membership, services and value for money. In .post, every member can design and implement innovative digital solutions in products and services to facilitate customer integration and inclusion, bridging the digital divide. To achieve this, the .post group has prepared a strategy to fully support members during their journey. Join the .post group now and be part of the change.
Thanks very much. So I encourage all of you to take a look at this because I believe, as I said earlier, I'm working on this project now, so it really is something I wanted to show. Having worked on this, working on this project and seeing exactly what the possibilities are, I am blown away by what's available and what's possible. And when linking it to what's going on in our region, and the Caribbean, and Latin America and the Caribbean, and small developing states, I think there are huge opportunities here that have not yet been explored. It's in the IG space. It is built right in the IG space. And I would encourage everyone who is interested in the digital economy in their country, in the region, to take a look at this, because I believe that what we're going to see next is an explosion of activity coming out of the beyond the basic e-commerce and into the layers below that. Now, when you move to logistics, move to the NFT level, blockchain, digital identity, DFS and fintech, these are the areas that I believe are going to really explode over the next 5 to 10 years. And of course, we have to cover up a layer of security and cybersecurity, which is one of the things that we are looking very closely at. So I'm going to encourage you, please contact the Secretariat at info.post more information about this particular project. So next slide, please.
Sorry.
Next slide. Yeah, thank you. Good. So this is contacts for our Maureen and myself. Feel free to reach out to us if you want to know more about what we're doing in the DC SIDS. It's very exciting work, as I said. Also very challenging. We need as much help as we can get. You don't have to be a member of the small and developing states group to join us, but I would really want to encourage all of you who are interested in this area, whether you're interested from the area of climate change and environment to sustainability, sustainable economic development, and just general interest in keeping 55 countries, working and moving and supporting each other. I want to encourage you to join us in this struggle and this fight, and to work together as we build a stronger internet and digital economy. Thank you very much. Any questions, please feel free to let me know. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy. It was very interesting to learn more about the small islands in the Caribbean and all the opportunities and challenges that I think the pandemic, at least for me and for here in Argentina, it really made us think more about the power of the internet. And the shutdown of last week made us, be aware of how important it is, but also
exactly.
How it is. It's really important that governments take action. And I would like to ask you: do you think that the governments in the Caribbean are like aware of the situation, or do you think it's more like just the public sector? It should be its responsibility, but do you think they're doing enough?
In what area in particular are you talking about? The overall
in digital economy mostly.
Yeah.
During the pandemic. I know they have a lot of issues, but
yeah, so it's a challenge, and it's something I understand because I have worked in government too. So
yeah.
It's a problem because, for example, using Haiti as a good example of this. Haiti is a country, as you might well know, has suffered quite a lot. So they would have to fix. I think it's a good example of a country that wants to move forward in the digital space, has a lot of effort going on within that country. Yet every time something they move forward, something happens that takes them back to the basics. That so from an earthquake to hurricane, to recently they had an assassination of their president. So across the Caribbean, we have similar challenges. Do we focus on the digital sector at the expense of the fundamental issues of roads, water, health, crime, etc.? Or do we push it down the priority list? My personal opinion is that we need to treat with it at the same time, right? So it's not a question of one versus the other. It should be in the priority list. And I think countries that will do well are those that put it in the list of priorities as opposed to putting it down with the priorities. So it's not an easy question to answer. I think the countries that will succeed, this is my personal opinion, in the next 10 years will be the countries that will put digital higher up in the priority list while still fixing and solving their other issues that they need to solve, the infrastructural and other issues. And those that don't do it will, I think, continue to be challenged. And we may hear some distressing stories from them in the next 5 to 10 years. And I hope that would not be the case, but that's a possibility.
Yeah, especially since you can't think the world outside of the internet right now. And I think the pandemic, again, has shown us how it is impossible to, we can study, we can talk to each other. So if we are left behind on that, I don't think that in the future there is much hope. But yeah, of course, there are many more important issues that are still left to solve. So again, thank you very much, Tracy. And I think that you left us a very hopeful message. And we as young people have to take action because it is our world and it is our future as well. So not only issues related to climate change, but also digital economy, human rights, and there are a lot of things that we can do and we can get involved. And I don't know if anyone else has another question. Juan, Benja, Herman, any comments for Tracy? If not, I think we could close this session. Juan, are you around?
I'm seeing some names of people that look very familiar from the
other
Youth IGF fellows, ambassadors. Where are you guys? I'm seeing Nicholas, Benjamin, Herman. What's going on? Let's hear from you. How are you? I haven't heard from you in a long time. Are you there?
Come on, don't be shy.
They definitely were not shy back in the day.
Yeah, that's the thing again with connecting with Zooms, it can become awkward, when there is a lost connection or something. You think you're talking to someone and you're like just talking to a screen. So I really hope this is the last year when we have to be, talking through the internet and not about the internet, but in real life. But it's serial. Well,
I hope so too. But I think we're going to be. I think one good thing about the pandemic is that the hybrid approach, I think, will become something that is. And I think that will increase participation levels at events because, as the IGF is going to show this year, that they're going to give equal. Well, let's fingers crossed. Equal status to if you're online or in person. So they're going to have one queue, one speaking queue. You have to use the technology to speak, to participate, and that'll be, I think, a good test of whether or not we actually need to physically go to an event to be on equal footing with someone who's actually there. Obviously, you cannot do certain things. You can't have lunch with somebody. Obviously, there are things that need to happen physically, but if you're actually in an event and you're participating, I hope that this would be a good step forward for the next IGF in Ethiopia. Hopefully it will be in person, and we'll probably see the continuation of this effort to get more people involved who are not physically there. Let's hope, knock wood.
Let's hope so. Yeah. Well, again, thank you, Tracy, very much. And thank you guys for being here and on YouTube as well. This is our last session, so now we are going to go to the main stage in Zoom. I will share the link if you guys want to come. But again, thank you, Tracy, very much. It was a pleasure to meet you, and I hope we get to meet in person, perhaps in the future IGFs.
Yes.
And it was very nice and very heartwarming to learn about the Caribbean. I think we as Latin Americans, at least here in Argentina, we don't really know, and we have a very biased view on the Caribbean, and we think that all the Caribbean is just for tourism, but it's nice to get to know the people there and not just have the biased view from media or from social media.
Come to my, but that's my beach, so it's still quite nice. Come and visit us.
I would love to. I can't find the link. Juan, do you have the link for? Oh wait, it should be.
Yes, we're sharing right now in the chat.
Yes, we've got to join. Yeah. I guess you could share that presentation to everyone as well if you wish.
Yeah, please.